Thank you for coming back. It's been an extraordinary day, I think, in many ways, and some fascinating, very moving, extraordinary sessions that we've had today. We now have our final keynote speech from someone who really, I don't feel I ought to need to introduce here in Cardiff. Vincent Kane, of course, for more than 30 years, is the voice and face of many programmes on BBC Wales, Wales Today, Week In, Week Out, many others. He joined Wales Today, I think, as a reporter in 1962, and has reported, of course, on Wales, but also on Aberfan many times and regularly in the years and the decades since. So it's a great pleasure to introduce him for this final keynote in today's session, Vincent Kane.
Okay, cheers. Actually, my friends, thank you very much, Professor, for your kind words. I just want to say before I start 2 words. One of them is credentials, and they're very important. What I'm going to deliver tonight is a journalist's considered verdict on Aberfan from the perspective of 50 years. I don't presume to say that this will be history's verdict on Aberfan, but I am confident enough to say that this is the considered view or verdict on Aberfan by a journalist who was heavily involved, and I recommend it to the historians. So that's the first one. I was, as you suggest, for 2 years a reporter on Wales Today, and then I became the founding presenter in 1964 of Good Morning Wales, the radio programme. Wales was the first of the nations and regions in the United Kingdom to have the guts to opt out of the Today programme on radio, on the Home Service as it was then. It was regarded as a very bold decision, but it turned out to be a very, very successful decision. So I was doing Good Morning Wales 5 days a week. And then in 1965, I became the founding host of Week In, Week Out, the current affairs half-hour programme. And that was running again for a year before Aberfan. So I was a busily engaged journalist before, during, and after Aberfan. Those are my credentials. I'm, by the way, very pleased to think that both Good Morning Wales and Week In, Week Out, and for that matter, Wales Today, are still running after 50 years, when I find it difficult sometimes to walk. Never mind. And the other word is emotion, and it's an important word. For many people, for young people, for middle-aged people, Aberfan is something that happened in history 50 years ago. Many of the students that will be here in the coming year, not only will they not have been born, but probably their parents wouldn't have been born. So they are able to look back at it dispassionately, to look at it, to wonder about it, to be appalled by it, to make judgments about it, but they won't feel for it, as those of us who are now a rapidly declining number who went through it closely feel. There was in the 60s a very popular song. It was a folk song, and it was originally written by Pete Seeger, Where Have All the Flowers Gone? You heard it all the time in the 60s. In 1965, Joan Baez produced a world best-selling record with her version of it. She saw it as a lament, an elegy for the young Americans killed in Vietnam. Where have all the flowers gone? Gone to graveyards, every one. When will they ever learn? Well, it was very topical at the time of Aberfan, and I was conscious of that, and I picked up in my mind, and I've retained it ever since, that image of the flower. I'm wearing a tie today, which I normally wouldn't be seen dead in, because it has flowers on it. Flowers. Some of you will remember way back to your school days, that line from Wordsworth, for me the meanest flower that blows brings thoughts that lie too deep for tears. Well, you know, I was professionally involved as a journalist in all the big anniversaries. The 10th anniversary, the 20th anniversary, the 30th anniversary. They called me back from retirement for the 40th anniversary to make a special program, and that seems only like yesterday. And now I'm here again for the 5th. And every time, every time, the thoughts come back that lie too deep for tears. Sometimes not too deep for tears, and the tears come. Not tonight. I have braced myself, and what I'm going to give you, whether you like it or not, is a robust, brutal journalist's verdict on Aberfan. But if I were to weep, I wouldn't be ashamed. Right, here we go. At the inquest into the deaths of 30 of the children killed in Aberfan in October 1966, as each child's name was read out, there were shouts of murderers. As one child's cause of death was given as asphyxia and multiple injuries, her father called out, "No, sir, buried alive by the National Coal Board." When the coroner remonstrated sympathetically with him, he persisted. "I want it recorded. Buried alive by the National Coal Board. That is what I want to see on the record." That is the feeling of all of us here present. Those are the words we want to go on the certificates. A few months later, after the Tribunal of Inquiry had found the Coal Board totally responsible for the Aberfan disaster and the deaths and destruction which it caused, and had most severely criticised the chairman, Lord Robins, when the disgraced chairman offered his resignation to the Minister for Fuel and Power and through him to the Prime Minister, the South Wales miners, along with their national union, petitioned the government to reject the resignation and keep Robins in post. How could that be? It still seems extraordinary after 50 years. But I believe that the balance, or perhaps the imbalance, between those conflicting points of view is the abiding conundrum of Aberfan, the riddle at the heart of the disaster itself and the series of shameful betrayals which followed it. The tip, as you all know, robbed the village of half its children. The maneuverings over the following years of the various organizations which might have and ought to have brought succor to the bereft community robbed them of natural justice. The tribunal report said there were no villains at Aberfan. Yes, there was. There was one big villain, coal. King Coal, to which we all paid grateful homage in Wales for most of the 20th century. It was coal and the determination to keep producing it at all costs which caused the tip slide. It was coal which killed the children. It was coal and the desperate fear of losing it which prompted the dereliction of duty before the disaster and the cover-ups and half-truths which followed. When Robins was appointed chairman by Macmillan in 1960, he told the Prime Minister that one thing and another in the NCB's finances made it next to impossible ever to make a genuine profit. But Supermac was unflappable. "Don't worry, dear boy," he said, "just blur the edges. Just blur the edges." And that's what Robins set about doing. He was an able man, an iron will, a dominant personality, and a natural leader. He quickly became known throughout the industry as Old King Coal. One big problem for coal in the 60s was oil, which was plentiful and cheap. You could fill the tank of your Austin Mini or Hillman Imp or Ford Escort and have plenty of change for a pound note. More worryingly, industry was wallowing in the stuff too. Another big problem was that there were, in the view of both the Macmillan and the Wilson governments, too many pits, and too many of them, especially in South Wales, were aging and creaking having been cut in the 19th century. But the third problem was the most politically sensitive of all: the miners and their union, the dreaded National Union of Mineworkers, the most militant of them all. Start closing pits and they'd bite your hand off. So Robins set about blurring the edges. He formed a close relationship, they called it a partnership, with Will Painter, communist miners' leader of the South Wales miners, just elected leader of the National Union of Mineworkers, in which they agreed that the only long-term hope of salvation for the coal industry was a drastic reduction in the number of pits and, as a consequence, the number of miners. That was the policy, and Painter, a senior officer in the International Brigade in the Spanish Civil War, was totally committed to it. He carried the union executive with him, including Will Whitehead, another communist who had succeeded him as leader of the South Wales miners. The pits were to be closed one by one, doing good by stealth, rather than in one fell swoop, which would surely have triggered a miners' revolt. As it was, there was a spate of unofficial strikes. The 60s were plagued with them. As a young television reporter, I cut my teeth reporting from various pits brought to a standstill at a moment's notice. I recall one occasion when the producer told me with a funny look before I set off that London wanted to use my piece in the 6 o'clock news, but they'd asked if I could get some shots of miners singing as they emerged from the pit gate. Tom Jones was already up and running. Perhaps a few years later on, they might have obliged with Delilah. When Robins and Painter took office, these numbers are important. There was 698 pits and 583,000 miners. When he left 10 years later, there were 292 pits and 283,000 miners. Job done? Well, the government thought so, especially since productivity had increased by 70%, which had enabled them to stop subsidies to ailing pits. Robins was a hand-on chairman. He insisted on getting out and about. In particular, he visited collieries. He set a target of 1 pit visit a week. He visited 350 pits in 10 years. But he closed 400. He closed one every 9 days, whereas he visited one every 10 days. And nobody noticed, except the miners in the pits which were closed, and crucially, the miners who were fearful their pit might be next, which leads us to Merthyr Vale Colliery. Merthyr Vale, with its 7 tips, 6 of them pensioned off, but number 7 still tipping full tilt. 7 pits which circled the village of Aberfan like 7 pillars of sombre unwisdom. 4 of them, including number 7, were perched on the sloping hillside. A policy described as unwise in what precious little national guidance there was on pit spoilage and tipping policy. And they were all built on water, either on something called the Brithdeer water line, or, in the case of number 7, on 2 underground springs which were clearly shown on ordnance maps. For 30 years or more, the streets and homes of the village were flooded, often knee-deep, and angry letters flew between the Borough Council and the Coal Board. Flooding is one thing, tip slides are another. There had been 2 of them at Aberfan prior to 1966, one in 1944 and one in 1963. Both of them, like the disaster in 1966, resulting from, and here I quote from the tribunal, the fundamental mistake of tipping over surface streams and springs or seepages from permeable strata forming the sloping hillsides without taking any preliminary drainage measures. so the tribunal was told. A soil mechanics expert said that with tipping, water is the source of all evil. It must not be allowed to get into the base of a tip. Failure to prevent that by proper drainage measures was the real explanation of the disaster. The 1963 slide at the dormant number 4 tip was a serious one. In fact, it was a dress rehearsal, almost an exact copy of the disastrous slide at number 7 3 years later, only in 1963, there was nothing in the way when it went through. But the coal board, that is to say, the 10 area, group, and divisional engineers, colliery, and production managers, named, blamed, and shamed by the tribunal, refused to take it seriously. Indeed, some of them refused to recognize that it had happened at all for 2 years. Merthyr's borough engineer sent out a round-robin letter at one point headed, "Danger from coal slurry being tipped at the rear of Pantglass School," but it evoked no response. The appalling inaction, irresponsibility, and failure to communicate still take one's breath away 50 years later. Consider Her Majesty's Inspectorate of Mines and Quarries, which had a divisional office in Cardiff. No inspector visited the Merthyr Vale tip complex at Aberfan for any purpose in the 4 years before the disaster, a period which included that big slide in 1963. And this next sounds unbelievable, but it's true. The senior inspector at the Cardiff Divisional Office of the Inspectorate of Mines and Quarries, who appeared before the tribunal, had been an inspector at the same Cardiff office 22 years earlier when the first big tip slide occurred at Aberfan. He confessed to the tribunal that the first time he even heard of it was in 1966. 20 miles up the road, this inspector of mines and quarries must have driven past it umpteen times, but he hadn't got a clue about what had happened there. Sir, later Lord Edmund Davis, who chaired the tribunal with consummate skill, grasped the heart of the matter. I'm going to quote just 3 sentences which seem to contain all that posterity needs to know about Aberfan. The stark truth of the tragedy flowed from the fact that, notwithstanding the lessons of the recent past, not for one fleeting moment did many otherwise conscientious and able men turn their minds to the problem of tip stability. The incidents preceding the disaster should have brought home vividly to any having interest in coal that tips placed on hillsides can and do slip, and having started can move quickly and far. So it was necessary to formulate a system aimed at preventing such a happening, to issue instructions, disseminate information, train personnel, inspect frequently. There was ample time for all this to be reflected upon and realized, and effective action taken. But the bitter truth is, they were allowed to pass unheeded into the limbo of forgotten things. No chance of Lord Davis following unheeded into that limbo after such an epic judgment of Denning-like proportions. And yet, the question which arises at this distance of time is why? Why did these conscientious and able men act or fail to act individually and collectively in this calamitous fashion? The reasons he gave, Edmund Davis gave, for the 10 individuals he named and blamed were bungling ineptitude in tasks for which they were totally unfitted, failure to heed clear warnings, and a total lack of direction from the top. He said they were not villains, but decent men, led astray by foolishness or ignorance or both. That, in all conscience, he said, is a burden heavy enough for them to have to bear without the additional brand of villainy. The iron fist in the velvet glove, well, it looks that way. Notice that he's added another adjective, another epithet to his description of them. Not just conscientious and able, but decent, conscientious and able. Then how the hell did it happen? How did 144 people, including 116 little children, come to lose their lives? Because I believe the learned judge omitted one reason, one vice from the list he tabled, and it was the most glaring vice of all: cowardice, moral cowardice. They failed to look, they failed to report, they failed to question these decent, conscientious, and able men because they were afraid, or half afraid, of what they would see, of what they would hear, of what they might be required to do. They dare not even talk to each other about it because they knew intuitively that there was something wrong with Tip 7. They were aware of the fears expressed time and again by the villagers, by the Borough Council. In January 1964, the Merthyr Express, the local paper, published a report of the meeting of the Town Planning Committee, quoting verbatim from the minutes Mrs. Williams, Councillor Mrs. Williams. There are dangers from surface tipping. We had a lot of trouble from slurry causing flooding, but if the tip moved, it could threaten the whole school. Some of the 10, even just one of them, must have read or been made aware of that report, that newspaper report. So serious, so startling, so threatening would it have been for the Coal Board to be criticised in public in this way that somebody, anybody, would have been delegated to check it out in order to deny it. But no, at the back of their minds lurked the fear that if they looked or asked, the answer they might be given or the evidence they might see would compel them to set in motion a process that would inevitably lead to the cessation of tipping, which would lead to an immediate cessation of production, which could well lead to a rapid closure of the colliery. To act or not to act, that was the question. To act was to put the existence of the pit in peril. So not to act, that was the answer. The pit, they thought, developed on the tip. No tip, no pit. The colliery manager wrote to the council in an argument about the introduction of tipping tailings, and in his letter he warned that any threat to tipping at Merthyr Vale was a threat to the future of Merthyr Vale. In 1965, the Coal Board applied to the council for planning permission to divert some overhead lines at the tipping facility at Merthyr Vale Colliery. The senior Coal Board official who wrote the accompanying letter concluded with this: if consent is not granted, the tipping life of the area will be curtailed, with a possible similar reaction on the life of the colliery. The closure policy of Robins Painter was full speed ahead by the mid-60s. It was ruthless. Once a colliery was identified as being unproductive or uneconomic, it was closed, no argument. In the Rhondda, pits were dying like flies. So fast that the BBC commissioned me and producer Gethin Stoodley-Thomas to make a television series that would capture something of the great coal tradition of the Rhondda, of the mines and of the miners who made Rhondda a word that rang around the world, and to make it before it vanished completely. And we were only just in time. That series was called The Long Street, and these days it's regarded as something of a history book. The 4 programs went out in the spring and early summer of 1966. They were well received, and we like to think at the time that they generated a feeling of national pride in what had been the warm relationship between coal and not just the Rhondda, but Wales and Welshness. 3 months later, Aberfan killed any such sentiment stone dead. Uncertainty and insecurity were rife throughout the Welsh coalfield. Will we be next? Where and when will the axe fall? In 1963, Will Whitehead gave an assurance to the anxious miners and officials at Merthyr Vale that the colliery was not on the list for closure. But that was the first they knew that there was such a list. And they can't be blamed if they wondered, given the problems facing the pit, how long it would be before they were added to it. Alan Talbot Davies, QC, told the tribunal, and I'm quoting, accepting that in 1963 there was no intention to close Merthyr Vale, two things need to be said. Without the tipping facilities available on Merthyr Mountain, the future of the colliery was to some extent endangered and imperiled. And having regard to an accelerated process of closures in South Wales, there might be an overriding fear that disaster might descend upon the village. He meant an unemployment disaster, not the disaster which did descend upon the village. Coal board witnesses appearing before the tribunal faced a catch-22 dilemma. If they gave even the slightest indication that they'd been worried about the stability of the tip, they were condemned out of their own mouths. You knew and you did nothing. But if they denied any such knowledge, they would be, as they were, criticized for ineptitude, foolishness, ignorance, and the rest of it. Perhaps they had no choice, because officially, the policy of the Coal Board, initiated and stubbornly maintained by Lord Robins from the moment he first appeared at Aberfan, 36 hours late, till he was summoned before the tribunal on its 74th day, the policy was to deny responsibility for what was a phenomenon of nature, a combination of heavy rain and unknown underground springs beyond human control. An act of God. Well, an act of Romans, more likely, and that's not quite the same thing. So the decent, conscientious, and able managers and engineers all towed the party line on the stand. One witness, however, swam against the tide. One witness, and one alone, had the courage or the temerity to assert that he had thought the tip could slide and that the slide could threaten life, but that he'd taken no action. This was the Member of Parliament for Merthyr, Mr. S.O. Davies, known to all and sundry far and wide simply as S.O. Now, S.O. was as old as Methuselah, as stubborn as a mule, and as tough as old boots. He was a miners' MP and had been for 30 years. He claimed he knew the local coalfield better than anybody else, and he was probably right. Nobody knew how old he actually was. When I interviewed him in his house, I repaired to the kitchen with Mrs. S.O. for a cup of tea while he put his collar on for the cameras. I asked Mrs. S.O. how old S.O. was, and she said, well, I'm not exactly sure. And then as I turned away, she added, and I don't think S.O. is exactly sure either. A few years after the disaster, the local Labour Party dropped him as their candidate in the 1970 election because they said he was too old. So he stood as an independent, and he was re-elected, much to the delight of those of us who knew a surefire winner when we saw one. His testimony is important, crucial, central, I have come to believe, to a true understanding of what I have called the conundrum of Aberfan. The tribunal report records that, quote, he thought tip number 7 might not only slide, but its sliding might reach the village, and that when he expressed this fear to miners in Aberfan, they told him, you make a row about that, and what will happen? They will close the blessed colliery. At this point, Edmund Davies took over the questioning. This is very interesting. I apologize if it bores you. You thought the slide might reach the village with a risk to life? Is that right? Yes, certainly. If you entertained substantial fear of risk to life, what did it matter if people asked you not to take steps? Why not take them if there was a risk to life? If I had taken them, I have more than a shrewd suspicion the colliery would be closed. So you went through a tortured process of thought, of weighing one against the other, the risk to life on the one hand and the risk of colliery closure on the other. You came down on the side of taking no action which might risk colliery closure. Now think before you answer, Mr. Davis. You understand it is a question of considerable gravity. Yes, I have thought, but I had to consider the general feeling of the mass of the people in the ward. Remember that phrase, the mass of the people in the ward. But if I had had any official approach made to me about the tip, I should not like to tell the inquiry that we could have stopped it, quite frankly, but if I'd been asked to do so, I would have done it. Thank you, said the judge, whatever the consequences for the colliery, said S.O. S.O.'s evidence was strongly challenged by counsel, not for the Coal Board, but significantly for the National Union of Mineworkers. And it's worth hearing what he said. If his account is truthful, and I'm not suggesting that he's deliberately untruthful, then he bears one of the largest personal burdens of responsibility for the disaster. He readily assumed more than any other individual in the case a knowledge of danger and absolute inactivity in dealing with it. He urged the tribunal not to accept S.O.'s evidence on the grounds that he didn't know what he was saying. And quite remarkably, that is what the tribunal did. Quote, he was the only witness to give such testimony, and we doubt that he fully understood the grave implications of what he was saying. Were we convinced that he did, he could not escape censure. My friends, take my word for it, in 1967, S.O. Davis was fully compos mentis, as he was when 3 years later, entirely on his own, he took on the official Labour candidate in one of the safest Labour seats in the country, turned the vote around and beat him. No. The question that dances around the episode of S.O. Davis's testimony is not whether he understood the grave implications of what he was saying, but whether they, the tribunal, understood the grave implications of what he was saying. And if they did, is that why they closed their ears and refused to accept it? For the implication of what he was saying is not just that he knew the tip could slide and endanger life, but that they, the community of Aberfan, knew that the tip might slide and endanger life. They knew because he told them. Not just the miners, but remember, the mass of people in the ward. And that's pretty grave. Should they not bear, what was it the NUM's counsel said? The largest burden of responsibility for the disaster, a knowledge of danger, an absolute inactivity in dealing with it. Not just inactivity, they positively urged him, pleaded with him, not to do anything about it. It gets worse. He told the judge, who had just warned him it was a question of considerable gravity, that if he had had any official approach made to him about the tip, he would have done it, that is, taken steps. From what official quarters might such an approach have come? Council officials? Union officials? It seems highly unlikely that information as momentous as that he had passed on to the mass of the people in the ward should not have leaked out eventually to reach official ears. In which case, why did those officials, whoever they were, not make the approach, which they undoubtedly should have in order to save endangered lives? If foreknowledge, coupled with inactivity, was indeed the cardinal sin, as the tribunal believed, then that personal burden of responsibility might have had to be shared around a lot more shoulders than those of the veteran MP. More cozy, perhaps, to write him off as being off his chump. They knew. They all knew. the council, the Aberfan community, anybody who read the Merthyr Express, the school headmistress, the colliery employees who worked on top of the tip and were still tipping until the tip started to go, and all the managers and engineers who were eventually pilloried by the tribunal. They all knew that there was a question mark over the safety up tip number 7, but they preferred to look the other way. Except those brave few, like some of the councillors, or that most brave headmistress who died with her pupils, who did ask questions or raise complaints, but who were fobbed off or ignored. If it is true that it was fear, a fear that dare not speak its name, which paralyzed the possibility of action, what was it that they were afraid of? Pit closure, which would have meant that a serious unemployment problem might blight the area. The fear was based on the widespread assumption that if tipping stopped, production would stop, the colliery would be added to that National Coal Board list of pits for closure, which they'd heard about in 1963. Was that a reasonable assumption? Yes, I think it was, or it must have seemed so at the time. The Coal Board, in partnership with the NUM, was actively looking for pits to close in their bid to make the industry viable. In 10 years, they closed 2/3 of the tips in Britain, and in 1966, they were more than halfway through that coal. The South Wales coalfield had suffered more than others. Why should a pit where production had stopped and there was no quick way to start it be spared? The reasons, the specific reasons why that tip slid down the hillside at Aberfan in 1966 were exactly those which the tribunal so painstakingly and scrupulously enumerated. But if, with 50 years hindsight, we look for the cause, the underlying cause, and if we look with uncluttered minds, now that coal is dead and gone, and all the scars and monstrosities which it inflicted on the landscape, not just of Aberfan, but of Wales, have been cleaned and cleared, how can we fail to conclude that the underlying cause was the intense pressure brought to bear on a frightened coal mining community by the policy of widespread and rapid pit closures implemented by the Coal Board, supported by the National Union of Mineworkers and 2 governments, Conservative followed by Labour, with the objective of making coal viable. That support in the trade union and by the Labour Party in Wales and elsewhere persisted after the disaster. Read the Hansard report of the debate in the Commons on the tribunal report. One after the other, Welsh Labour MPs in mining constituencies spoke in mitigation of the wholly to blame Coal Board and urged that Robins, who'd submitted his resignation, should remain in post. Leo Absi was the sole Labour exception. Emlyn Hewson for the Liberals, Gwynfor Evans for Plaid Cymru, and David Gibson-Watt for the Conservatives all wanted him to go, but the Welsh Labour Party wanted him to stay on, and the trade union wanted him to stay on, and everybody else who petitioned the Prime Minister wanted him to stay on, because never mind Aberfan, in spite of Aberfan, he was doing a good job, doing what had to be done, and he was the only man who could do it. I haven't made that up. Those are not my words. That is what they said. Documents published 30 years later showed that Robins orchestrated the campaign for Wilson to reject his resignation. He didn't send it in until he knew it would be rejected. He even made the Minister for Fuel and Power, Richard Marsh, remove a sentence from the letter he would send back rejecting the resignation. Incidentally, and this might stick in your throats, the best speech made in the debate came from the shadow Minister for Fuel and Power, who just happened to be one Margaret Thatcher. With great forensic skill, it has to be said, she ripped the Coal Board and its chairman to pieces. She revealed one piece of Robin's chicanery which has escaped everybody's attention. At the time of the disaster, the NCB's divisional chairman, the chairman for Wales and the West of England, Mr. Kellett, was attending a power conference in Japan. He was given instructions straight from Robins to stay there. and he didn't come back in time to give evidence to the tribunal. But part of the case advanced by counsel for the board was that the absence of a tipping policy should not be laid at the door of the board, but at the door of the division. Surely, said Mrs. Thatcher, if someone is going to advance that argument, he must ensure that the head of the division is at least in the country so that he can be brought before the tribunal to give evidence. Instead, he had ensured that Mr. Kellett stayed out of the country. The irony of all this, ladies and gentlemen, is that both sides were proved to be wrong in the long run. Coal could not be made viable, no matter how many pits were closed. Di Francis was in the 60s secretary of the Welsh Miners' Union, grey and slow-spoken like a wise old owl. He too was a communist, but he was also a Methodist. 4 parts Marxist, he told me, and 1 part Methodist. Like a dry martini, shaken but not stirred. Certainly not shaken, or stirred at least, because he had the great gift for a trade unionist of never losing his temper on air. I remember one television debate about the merits of expensive coal versus cheap oil, which he concluded with a smile and a shake of the head, and in that slow, didactic manner, with his strong, beguiling accent, he said, "Vincent, the Arabs will not forever live in tents." Damn right they didn't. Not so many years later, at like the time that the striking miners were winning the Battle of Saltley Gates under the leadership of a young Arthur Scargill, OPEC came on stream, and the price of oil went up 250, then 300% in 18 months, throwing Western economies into a crisis which is still playing itself out. But even without cheap oil, coal was not competitive. Throughout the 70s, up to and beyond the final and fatal miners' strike, coal from Poland and from faraway Australia, even with the costs of transport thrown in, was cheaper than British coal. Robins had been right when he told the Prime Minister in 1960 that it was next to impossible for the coal board to make a profit. The illness which he and Painter diagnosed, despite their drastic surgery, was terminal. And the Merthyr Vale community were wrong too. The pit was not closed. In fact, it lasted longer than the National Coal Board, which was wound up in 1987. Merthyr Vale was one of the last Welsh pits to go when it closed in 1989, 23 years after the disaster. About a dozen years after the disaster, I made a television profile of Lord Edmund Davis for Week In, Week Out. He was retired, a widower, living over the shop at Gray's Inn, where we set up the cameras in his beautifully appointed rooms. Sadly, he had lost his vigor. He'd been a tough cookie in his time. Just before the tribunal, he was the judge at the trial of the great train robbers, where he handed around 30-year sentences to all the principal villains. But now he was old and rather frail, fully understanding, but somehow gentle. Nevertheless, I reminded him of the men whom the report had named and blamed, not villains, but decent men, etc., etc. At the time, I told him, there had been much surprise and some anger that they'd not been charged with manslaughter. He thought for a moment, and then he said, but we thought they would be. We assumed that they would be. And that was that. He wouldn't be taken any further on it. He may, of course, have been speaking with hindsight. There had been a considerable furor about the matter. But taking his words at face value, what they mean is that this very senior and distinguished judge and his 2 expert lay colleagues, having examined the whole matter in detail for nearly 3 months, were of the view that there was enough prima facie evidence against certain of the witnesses to warrant a prosecution for manslaughter. Why was such a prosecution not initiated? And who would have been responsible for the decision not to initiate it? Who else but another Welsh Labour MP for a mining constituency, who just happened to be the Attorney General, Elwyn Jones. He muzzled the press before the tribunal, and this is quite extraordinary. He gave an assurance, the Attorney General, before the tribunal started that there would be no prosecutions. Can you believe it? And he officially ruled them out after the tribunal's report was to hand. We cannot say now that they were guilty of manslaughter, nor could we say at the time that they were guilty of manslaughter. Only a legal trial could establish that or otherwise. But to deny such a trial was to deny the Aberfan community natural justice. And that was a betrayal, the first betrayal of many, as it turned out. Lord Robins and the Coal Board betrayed the Aberfan community continuously. Robins fought tooth and nail to limit the cost of Aberfan to the Coal Board. The opening offer, as you know, to each bereaved family was £50, and it wasn't increased to £500 and paid out until 1970, when Robins' 10-year stretch was over. He seized on a doubtful report that the remaining 6 tips were safe as grounds for refusing to move them. Instead, he offered to contour them and blend them into the slopes of the Merthyr Mountain. Perhaps he had some kind of theme park in mind. Anyway, eventually, he was forced to remove the tips. So he persuaded the Prime Minister that the appeal fund should be raided for a contribution to the cost. Now, the fund had reached 1.6 million, 30 million today. That's a lot of money. And, quote, under intense pressure, quote, the trustees were forced to surrender £150,000, 3 million today, which was 10% of the fund. This was outrageous and probably illegal. But the trustees, who were generally fairly useless anyway, just caved in. They should have threatened to resign en masse, but they didn't. And that was a betrayal of the Aberfan community. The Charity Commission, which many years later formally apologized, just nodded the outrage through. And that was a betrayal of the Aberfan community. Indeed, the Commission was hostile to the community from the start. At one stage, they insisted that money should be paid only to those parents of whom it could be established that they'd been close to the child or children. The bereft community might have looked to the government, a Labour government, for support, but they didn't find any when it mattered, other than warm words of sympathy. In particular, they might have looked for support to the Secretary of State for Wales, George Thomas, who'd taken over from Cledwyn Hughes. Wilson, the Prime Minister, was a pragmatist. Generally speaking, he would do what he was able to do, what he could get away with. He would push at a door, and if it gave, he would go through it with his policy. But if the door didn't give, if there was resistance, he would stand back and think of something else. Wilson was aware that the decision to take the money was highly contentious. He would certainly have discussed it with his Welsh Secretary of State. That was what the Welsh Secretary was for, a funnel through which Welsh matters and problems were channeled into the Cabinet and the Prime Minister, and in reverse, government policies were channeled back out to Wales. He spoke for Wales, for heaven's sake. Whether he demurred and argued with Wilson about it, we don't know, but he accepted it, and that was all the Prime Minister needed. I thought then, and I'm convinced now, that if the Secretary of State for Wales, George Thomas, had told Wilson that he would resign if this cruel and probably illegal policy went through, the Prime Minister would not have felt strong enough to do it. But he didn't. And from the Secretary of State for Wales, that was a great betrayal of the Aberfan community. 30 years later, another newly appointed Secretary of State for Wales, Ron Davies, redeemed the reputation of the office and of his party when he insisted that the money should be repaid to the fund. And in 2007, the Welsh Assembly paid another £2 million to bring it in touch with inflation. For Ron Davies, It was the honourable, and here's that word again, the decent thing to do. And I salute him across the years. But if I'm scarifyingly honest, in one sense, the media betrayed the Aberfan community. And I was of the media, and though I was young and a beginner, in quite a prominent role. Somehow or another, after the disaster, as controversy followed controversy, though never directly articulated, a general climate of opinion developed in which the surviving community was seen to be the problem. They were awkward or greedy and grasping. There was talk of the appeal fund being the second Aberfan disaster. They were troublemakers. As I say, they were the problem. While the journalists, the press, and the broadcasters didn't say as much, didn't light this fire of rumor, we fanned the flames in so much as we didn't jump on it and smother it as robustly as we should. We didn't shout as loud as we could until Wales was deafened by our hammering home the simple truth that it was the trustees who were the problem and the Charity Commission. It was the government and the politicians who were the problem. And most of all, it was the National Coal Board, which was getting away with murder, and especially Alf Robins, who were the problem. The Aberfan community were the victims, not the problem. And we were letting their tormentors off the hook. As you well know in this institution, Professor, the press, the media, the Fourth Estate has an abiding responsibility to probe and to penetrate. In the Aberfan period, perhaps Wales's darkest hour in the 20th century, we should have been passionate in support of the truth. Instead, we were pedestrian. I've made no mention of the children. That is because I've found a special place for them, which on this 50th anniversary I urge you to share. I run a picture of them through my imagination, laughing and chattering as they leave assembly and settle in their classrooms. And then I stop the picture at that moment, freeze it. Don't proceed a second further. Don't dare to go there. Freeze them in time, like the lovers on Keats' Grecian urn, forever panting and forever young. Keats it was, who said a thing of beauty is a joy forever. And so they are, frozen in time at that moment, happy, innocent, and beautiful. Immortalize them like that, and they will live forever. Like the children of Hamlin in Browning's Pied Piper, who left our world behind as they, tipping and skipping, ran merrily after the wonderful music with shouting and laughter. Then lo, when they reached the mountainside, a wondrous portal opened wide, as if a cavern were suddenly hollowed, and the piper advanced, and the children followed. Did I say all? No, one was lame and could not dance the whole of the way. And in after years, if you would blame his sadness, he was used to say, "It's dull in our town since the children left, and I can't forget that I'm bereft." Just such a one is Gaynor Madgwick, from whom you heard this afternoon, pulled injured at the age of 8 from one of the classrooms where her friends died and her brother and sister were killed. She was left to live out her life, and she's written about that in this story, which is sad, sweet, sentimental, and authentic, and I recommend it to you. And I thank you all very much for listening to me. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Vincent, for a robust and rigorous, very strongly argued verdict, and in many ways the perfect final word on today's events, I think. So it's been an extraordinary day, as I said before. I'd like once again to thank all of our speakers and our panellists and our chairs. Particularly, again, I'd like to thank those of you from Aberfan and from the community who've joined us here today and made it such an extraordinary day. I'd like to thank James and Janet who helped to organise today's event, and the support from the NUJ as well as the Cardiff University City Region Exchange scheme who made it possible. There are drinks downstairs now for those of you who are able to stay a little longer. But once again, please join me in thanking all of those who've contributed to the night.